Hello there, guys. We are back with our fourth revision video, and we're of course going to be looking at the fourth part of a spec today, looking at conflict over Germany between 1947 to 1949. And this is a really thrilling kind of video and interesting part of the course because it's kind of the first major flashpoint within the Cold War that we will be looking at today. Now, before we get into the video, what I want us to focus in on is the spec. And I've put the spec down here, but equally, I'm going to go to my big document here because we always want to go to the spec because the spec is what we need to know. So, spec unit 4, conflict over Germany. We need to know this. Developments within the four sectors, including Bisonia and currency reform, the Berlin blockade, and the creation of East and West Germany, and the formation of NATO. Those are the different units that we need to be aware of for this part of the spec. But for me, I would really chunk this up in a slightly different way. I would think of it as more the causes of the Berlin blockade. And I think the causes of the Berlin blockade actually come into this unit here, a bit of unit 3. And these two units here, which also deal with the causes. I then look at the narrative of the Berlin blockade, which is this bit here, this middle one. And then these are kind of the consequences of the Berlin blockade. And that's basically how I'm going to chunk up this video because I think it works much more nicely in terms of tying Unit 3 into Unit 4 and just working more naturally for a historian to think about causes, narrative, and consequence. And then the final thing that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that once we've completed this video today on conflict over Germany, we will have completed our first kind of overall topic within the Cold War course. A reminder that the Cold War course is split up into kind of 4 sequential chunks. The origins of the Cold War, the widening of the Cold War, the global Cold War, confrontation and cooperation, the Brezhnev era, and the ending of the Cold War. Now, the point is, once we've done the fourth video, we will have done this first big blob, which is a major achievement for us. And then, of course, we'll be looking at the widening of the Cold War in Unit 5, where we'll look at US containment in action in Asia. So without further ado, let's get cracking with our video today, looking at conflict over Germany between 47 to 49. Because, I mean, ultimately, the question of what to do with Germany turned tension into direct confrontation by spring 1948. If we flash forward to the end of this period by 49, Germany's divided, Berlin had been blockaded, NATO had been formed, and Europe was locked into 2 blocks. And if we really go to August 1949, we also have the development of nuclear weapons within the USSR, which is a major, major change within the nature of the Cold War because the US's nuclear monopoly or atomic monopoly is broken at that point. So let's start off by thinking about the situation in Germany. And I want to start almost by thinking about the constitution. Okay, how was Germany divided post Potsdam? So we know that Germany being divided into, let me just get my pen, into 4 different zones. We know that this was agreed at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, and then it was confirmed at Potsdam in July to August 1945. And that broke Germany up into 4 different zones. The British zone, as we can see here, the Soviet zone, the American zone, and the French zone there. And also it divides Berlin up in the exact same way, with the Soviet sector, the American sector, the British sector, and the French sector too, as we can see. And I've got other maps of Germany throughout these slides that you can see if you do need to view it in more detail. So what then happens? Well, each of the 4 zones of post-war Germany had a military governor, but would be administered differently. So they would each have a governor that would essentially govern each individual region. And that way they could be run in slightly different ways based off the locale. However, the main 4 powers had to coordinate action through the ACC, and the ACC stands for the Allied Control Council. Think of it as almost like a mini conference or a mini council that major decisions that would affect the overall of Germany have to go through. And the key point here, and this was established at Potsdam and Yalta, the decisions made at the ACC had to be unanimous. And what unanimous means is it means that, well, one power could block everything. If one of the 4 don't agree to something, then it cannot happen. Because when something is unanimous, it means that every single party has to agree with it. Cooperation in this instance then essentially depends on trust. And unfortunately, at this point of the Cold War, as we get into 46 and 47, trust was disappearing very, very, very quickly. What we need to know for this bit of the spec, if we go back, development within the four sectors, we just looked at the Constitution, but what we're now going to do is actually just look at each of the four different sectors, just a couple of bullet points on each bit so that we've got some sense of context surrounding each one. The final thing, I forgot to mention this, how stupid of me. Can I just draw your attention to this graph? It is fascinating, this graph on the first slide. It says, in October 1947, an opinion poll conducted by the US occupation forces in Germany asked people about their attitudes towards the four allies and whether they trusted them to treat Germany fairly. The results included the following statistics. So the Americans 63%, the British 45%, the French 4%, and the Soviets 0%. And a lot of that is the brutality that the Soviets and the Red Army treated the German citizenry with in 1945 before the war had ended. And this is actually a really quite heartbreaking kind of case study, but I will give you this as an example. In Berlin, in kind of April to May 1945, we see the biggest cluster of abortions in history. And one of the reasons we see that is because basically the mass rape of German women by Soviet soldiers. And that is just one illustration and one example of why the Soviets were so distrusted and hated throughout Germany at that time, which is clearly revealed by this poll. Right, let's go through then and have a look at our different four sectors. So we're going to start with the Soviet sector. As you can see, I've sort of drawn the arrow here. So we're going to be looking at the Soviet sector. There we go. Perfect. So, initially, Stalin actually allowed four political parties to operate within East Germany. Well, I shouldn't say East Germany, sorry. The Soviet sector. I'm getting ahead of myself. That was the KPD, so the old Communist Party, the SPD, which was the Socialist Party, the LDPD, and the CDU. Now, the LDPD is the old Liberal Party, which is a centrist party, and the CDU is kind of a centre-right conservative party. But what he then does is Stalin, by 1946, allows the SPD and the KPD and forces them basically to merge into a new party called the SED, which is basically the Socialist Unity Party. That's what it stands for, Socialist Unity Party. The word for unity in German begins with an E. My German isn't great, but I can try my best. It is the Sozialistische Einheitspartie Deutschland, or the SED. I'm not going to write that out for various reasons. So what then happens in the Soviet sector? Well, there's land reform, there's nationalization, there's centralized control, which all follows, okay? Classic kind of left-wing things. You nationalize industry, you begin to introduce land reform and divide it up for all different classes, and you begin to centralize control and give more power basically to the state. They also established this people's democracy model, which is aligned with Moscow. And crucially, there's increasingly prioritized political control over genuine German unity. Now, what that means is it's basically about the Soviets beginning to introduce communist elements and Sovietize their sector, as opposed to basically support the potential reunification of Germany at some point. And this is important because if we think about these four different sectors and we think that all four of our countries are committed to Germany being unified at some point, or in theory are unified, if the Soviets begin to turn their zone into a more left-wing or communist state, it makes it much less likely that our other three powers are going to agree to it. Because there is the worry, there is the threat that ultimately a new unified Germany would turn into a Soviet satellite state or a communist state, okay? And that's what we need to be aware of there. Yeah. And just to summarize this, Stalin does still support unity. He does still support the unification of Germany, but unsurprisingly, only if it means a communist Germany. And that is a key point that we need to be aware of. Okay, let's have a look at the British zone then. Let's go all patriotic. Let's look at the British zone. So we're going to look at the Western zones now. You could probably notice I've put the communist zones or the communist sector in red for the Red Army, or red being the colour of socialism, communism, and I've put the Western zones in blue. So let's start off by looking at the British zone. So the British zone was really important because it actually included the Ruhr area around here, which is, of course, Germany's major industrial and coal-producing region. Also faced heavy economic burdens, feeding 22 million people, so a significant amount of the population. And this actually pushes Britain towards closer cooperation with the USA, because we know at this time, Britain, that's my pound sign, is facing kind of bankruptcy. Britain is really, really struggling financially, and that pushes Britain closer to the Americans. And just think about the ideas of the loan that John Maynard Keynes attempted to organise and the Marshall Plan money. Almost factor that within this here. So this pushes the British much closer to cooperation with the US. The West fears Soviet access to the Ruhr. And ultimately, they believe that the Ruhr resources would weaken Western recovery if the Soviets were to get their hands on it, which is one of the reasons they don't want that unification. And crucially, what then happens in 1947 is because the Brits basically are struggling to administer their zone, there is that shift, and there is the creation of Bizonia by 1947, which signals a shift towards division within Germany. You might think it's actually unity, and it is unity between Britain and America because you get the creation of Bizonia, but it is unity, of course, because the Soviets fear and dislike the creation of Bizonia because they see it as increasing economic integration and essentially economic empire building here and breaking the spirit of what was agreed at Potsdam. So that's Britain. Now let's look at the US. Let's have a look at the US zone, okay? So this is the US zone. So initially, the Americans are quite ambiguous about a unified Germany versus the divided Germany. They are in theory in favour of a unified Germany, but that very quickly turns into becoming increasingly ambiguous. Why? Well, basically because they fear that a unified Germany would fall to communism because of the Soviet strength in Eastern Europe and the consolidation of control of Eastern Europe by Stalin. They oppose continued economic deprivation of Germans. Go back to our kind of post-Versailles understanding of Germany. What happened? Well, France wanted to punish Germany the most. Britain were in the middle, and the Americans were basically the kindest or the most lenient on Germany. Why was that? Well, because ultimately they were so far away from Germany in terms of it being outside of their sphere of influence traditionally geopolitically, and also there is this idea of if we can reintegrate Germany within this wider trading bloc, then it can actually benefit us from an economic perspective, which makes total sense. And much like in Japan, economic recovery becomes a top priority for the Americans. Now, they are concerned about Soviet influence and centralized control that's beginning to happen in the Soviet sector. That's unsurprising because of the Soviet perception of, well, politics and their political ideology. And as we said, they support economic recovery and a federal structure in Germany. And that's actually a key driver behind this idea of a West German state, is basically introducing federalist principles, much like what exists in the different states that make up the United States of America, of course. And very quickly, probably the least significant zone. Initially, actually, it's worth remembering that France weren't actually supposed to be part of the different zones, but they do push for it across 1945, and they do get a small zone, which is obviously close to the French border. You have to imagine the French border being here. And that's why when you think, oh, Britain couldn't afford to administer their zone, but France could, well, it's like, well, actually, this is an extension of the border. So it's actually a lot easier for France to put troops there, for France to administer it, whereas actually much more difficult for Britain because they don't share a direct border with Germany. So it's much more challenging to put troops in there. So what does France favour? Well, France basically wants Germany to be more permanently weakened. They sought small, weak states to ensure French security. So they kind of wanted to weaken and actually not develop Germany as much as the Americans do. They were actually quite obstructive at the Allied Control Council cooperation, and ultimately they do eventually, in 1948, support the idea of Trizonia and Western consolidation to prevent Soviet expansion. So initially there is this threat of Germany within the French thinking, but then by the time we get to kind of like 1948, and the Cold War is more clearly underway, it is about the French picking a side, and unsurprisingly, they side with the West, and they support the consolidation of Germany and the kind of building up of the eventual FRG to prevent Soviet expansionism. So those are our 4 different zones there that we've looked at, and that's just a bit of context in each one and the different perceptions of how each power kind of felt about Germany at the time. What we're going to do now is look at the causes of the Berlin blockade. So we've got 4 causes. I'm going to rattle through them, then we'll go through each one in a bit more detail. Cause 1, the division at Yalta and Potsdam. That's a long-term cause, okay? Ultimately, the division there, we could say that it's stored up problems for the future because the chunking and sectorization of Germany into 4 different zones or sectors ultimately stored up problems because of the different fundamental political ideologies driving each nation, capitalism and communism. Secondly, the formation of Bizonia. We could say, or Stalin would argue, that was antagonistic. It broke the spirit of Yalta and Potsdam. It wasn't agreed through the Allied Control Council. This actually is fundamentally about American imperialism, and therefore Stalin was very angered by this. We've then got the Marshall Plan money, which again, a reminder, Stalin saw as dollar imperialism. So again, angering the Soviets. And then finally, the Council of London, or the Conference of London, that we'll see in early 1948, that then leads to the establishment of the Deutschmark, which is accelerating economic integration within the Western zones. That again angers Stalin and is seen as dollar imperialism, which is the final trigger point that then causes, on June the 24th, sorry, that should be 1948, not 9. What a muppet, you muppet, Mr. Trojan. Of course, that leads to the Berlin blockade. I'm going to have to change that now, otherwise I will never forgive myself. 48. And I've definitely used this slide multiple times. Here. 1948. Let's say it one more time. June the 24th, 1948. Lovely. Right. So let's go to here. Brilliant. So we've gone through our causes there, our 4 different causes, and I'm going to go through each one now in a little bit more detail. And we're going to start by thinking about Bizonia, actually. We're not going to start by thinking about the division at Yalta and Potsdam because we spoke about that loads in video 1, so we don't need to go through it again. But let's think a little bit about Bizonia. So we know that ultimately the US does shift its focus from wanting a unified Germany to preferring a divided Germany because they're fearful that Germany could ultimately fall to communism. If it was unified, it would be more likely to fall to communism than capitalism. So therefore, a divided Germany makes sense in order to, again, contain the spread of communism and develop West Germany as this strong economic anchor in Central/Western Europe. We then get the merging of Bizonia in January 1947 between Britain and the US, which signals that move towards a West German state, as you can see here in the image. It angers the USSR because it's seen as a violation of the Potsdam spirit and the agreement of 4 different zones, and the Soviets see it as almost capitalist encirclement around their zone and increasing capitalist integration from Western nations. We know, of course, this fundamentally forms part of the Truman Doctrine, and then we know that the Truman Doctrine leads to the Marshall Plan because the Marshall Plan, I'll say it again, is the economic and financial manifestation of the Truman Doctrine. How do you keep capitalist countries capitalist? You give them loads of freaking money, okay? And that's what we see. We know, announced by George Marshall, $13.5 million to 16 different European nations over the next 5 years between 47 to 52. The biggest recipients, Britain, of $3.3 billion, I should say, and a conditional loan that they had to be spent on US goods to help increase and accelerate production in America and ultimately grow the US economy. And we know that Stalin sees this as dollar imperialism. And it was crucial in accelerating the division and tensions in Europe in the early phase of the Cold War. So we've kind of done 2, actually I would say we've done 3 of our key causes there. We didn't look at Yalta and Potsdam, but it's a pretty simple cause. We then looked at the formation of Bizonia and how that angers Stalin, and then we looked at the Marshall Plan and how that equally angers Stalin. across 47 and 48. But what we haven't spoken enough about is this idea of the Council of London and the creation of the Deutschmark by 1948. And that's what we're going to look at now. So the Council of London, basically from around February 1948 up until June time, there were several conferences in London. Several conferences or councils in London, you can phrase it either way, made up of essentially the Western nations that meet and take decisions unilaterally that impact on Germany, which massively angers Stalin again. So the London Conference agrees in the following. They agree in basically a West German constitution. They don't actually formalize it or introduce it, but they're discussing it. And they also decide that they're going to introduce a new currency, the Deutschmark. And this would basically be the beginning of the formation of a West German state. That basically takes place on the 7th of June 1948 with the West German formal constitution established. Now, this enormously angers Stalin. Why? Currency reform is huge because money equals sovereignty. Money equals power. And the USSR see it as economic consolidation of a Western bloc. And therefore, Stalin's reaction on the 24th of June 1948 is the Berlin blockade. And Stalin blocks all road and rail links to West Berlin, and the Cold War begins to turn physical. So this is basically the direct trigger cause. Now, in fairness, this may seem like Western animosity because of the decisions here being taken unilaterally. A reminder, unilaterally means being taken by yourself without consulting others. But in fairness to the West, they would have said, well, we were looking at what was happening in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in the Soviet sector in Germany, where there was increasing centralization and control, and we were just protecting Western values, Western beliefs by creating this unity. That's the potential counterpoint. But basically, by the 24th of June 1948, the Berlin blockade has begun. And we're going to look at the Berlin blockade now. There's a really, really lovely graph here where you can basically see the Allied air corridors that were used from here into Berlin, or should we say into West Berlin. We've got the corridor here into West Berlin, and then we've got the Hanover to Magdeburg line here into West Berlin, which is this top line here. And you can see some of the other road, railway, waterways, road checkpoints, rail checkpoints, waterway checkpoints, and obviously the air corridors we just went through into Berlin. So what actually happens with the Berlin blockade? Well, the day after the Deutschmark is introduced, Stalin decides that the Soviet Union are going to react and retaliate by blocking all road and rail links into the Western zones. And what that means is basically into Berlin, but also by fortifying this border as well. Now, the key players for the West are Ernest Bevin, who is British Foreign Secretary at the time, and Cassius Clay as well, that we will look at in a bit, okay, which we will be looking at in a moment. Brilliant. Now, they are the key individuals in driving the Allied response. And Bevin basically is adamant that Allies must not use military force to access West Berlin, but must keep it supplied with the essentials. And that's what we're going to look at now when we're thinking about what was actually introduced. Brilliant. So let's have a look now what was introduced. So we've got Operation Vittles, which is the Berlin Airlift. That is the official code name of the Berlin Airlift. And coal, fuel, medicine and food was delivered into Berlin. Roughly 5,000 tons a day was introduced to the western zones in Berlin, which is a huge amount. And actually the top kind of estimate, they eventually got up to 8,000 tons a day of food that they were delivering. And it basically meant that there was a plane going in about every 3 minutes into the western zones in Berlin to help food, clothe, and support people there. So that is the key bits from there. We've got our key individuals that we need to be aware of: Ernest Bevin and Lucius Clay. I didn't write that up. I think there we go. And Lucius Clay. So we've got Bevin, we've got Lucius Clay, and ultimately 5,000 tons of food, fuel, coal, and medicine being introduced to the Western zones every single day. Brilliant. And I want to go into Ernie Bevan in a bit more detail because he is such a fascinating character. He really, really is. He's described as Labour's Churchill. Andrew Adonis actually wrote a book called Labour's Churchill on Ernie Bevan. He's Foreign Secretary from 1945 through to 51. He's hugely influential in Clement Attlee's Labour government. And, not only was he influential in setting up NATO, but he was one of the key architects behind the response to the Berlin blockade that we do need to be aware of. So just a bit more detail on the blockade itself. You can see the flights per month. Again, at its peak, there was about a flight every 3 minutes that was landing in the Western zones or sectors in Berlin. And also we can see the kind of tonnage of supplies delivered each month. Now, this is each month. If we actually do it by day, again, average of around 5,000 tons a day. But you can see by the April of 49 just how much they were delivering, significant amounts of aid into there. What we need to think about now is kind of, there's a lovely image of Berlin children greeting an American transport plane during the airlift. But what we need to think about now is kind of why does Stalin actually end the Berlin blockade? And it ends on the 12th of May 1949. And there's this lovely image here, blockade ends, airlift wins. And basically, one of the main reasons that Stalin ends it is it was only really strengthening Western unity. It was actually bringing the Western powers together. It wasn't really dividing them, and it wasn't leading to a chance of a stronger chance of a kind of communist Germany, or a unified communist Germany. If anything, it was doing the opposite, to be totally transparent with you. And we see this with the formation of NATO in April 1949 during the Berlin blockade. That obviously strengthens Western unity, that we'll see in more detail in a moment because it's one of our key consequences. Also, another thing that we cannot forget is that Stalin knows he is very close to nuclear weapons. Stalin is months away from testing the atomic bomb. That successful test takes place in August 1949, but he's basically a few months away from it, and he knows that. So he has less of an issue in kind of almost backing down on this key issue, knowing that he's soon to have nuclear parity with the USA. He also fails in his aims to prevent the creation of a West German state, which quickly follows. And ultimately, you can say that containment was a success here. I mean, part of the reason behind the Berlin airlift and the creation of the West German constitution and the Deutschmark was to try to contain communism. And you can argue that it was a success in this instance. And is this containment actually working effectively? That's one of the potential perceptions and views here. Brilliant. Let's look at the consequences of the Berlin blockade here. Well, the final thing that I want to just mention is this was obviously a huge propaganda victory for the West, I should say. It shows Western superiority, Western power in terms of the amount of aid that they're able to deliver. It also arguably shows them as more humane because they're not the ones blocking off zones, and they're able to just simply fly in food, coal, fuel, and supplies to help support the citizenry of that area and the population of that area. And ultimately, they're seen to be the good guys in some ways here. So let's look at the consequences. We've got 4 consequences. I'm going to put them up on screen, then we'll go through each one in more detail. Consequence 1, the creation of East and West Germany. Fundamental, crucial for the duration of the Cold War. Then the formation of NATO, I can say the exact thing, absolutely crucial, foundational for the Cold War. Then increased tension, military hostilities, and the ossification of 2 blocks, which we know is Mr. Sayers' favourite phrase. And then in the long term, we get the formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which is almost a retaliation to the creation of NATO, although it does take 6 years to be formalised. So let's start off by looking at the creation of East and West Germany. Now, just a reminder that West Germany is the FRG, okay, the Federal Republic of Germany, Federal Rep Germany. That is West Germany. but ends up being that union of the three different zones, the FRG, its own country. And yet it was decided on creating West Germany in 1948 in the lead up to the Berlin blockade. The constitution's finally approved early in 1949, and Konrad Adenauer, the new leader, takes over. And we'll look at Adenauer in a moment on the next slide, basically. When we're thinking about East Germany, we should know that East Germany is, of course, called the GDR, the German Democratic, lol, democratic with quotation marks because it was not very democratic, Republic. And that was equally set up in 1949. The constitution there is drawn up in March 1949. It has democratic in the name, but it's a facade. A facade is like basically a lie. It's a face that's empty. It was in reality a one-party state. The SED, the Socialist Unity Party, they're the Communist Party that take sole control. So it's not really democratic, the GDR. But after that point, we have the division of Germany, and of course we have the division of Germany in the Cold War up until 1990. So Germany is now formally divided, basically for the next. How good's my maths? 41 years from 1949 up until 1990. Although I suppose you could say it was divided in some ways from 1945, from the division into 4 different zones after Potsdam. So yeah, there's depending on how you want to periodize it, 45 years or 41 years there. Okay, let's look in a bit more detail at Konrad Adenauer because he's such a fascinating individual. I've got a brilliant book on his life. If you do want, it was a chapter from a book on his life, written by Henry Kissinger. Actually, it was called 6 Studies on World Leadership, and one of the chapters is on Adenauer. Fascinating individual, fascinating life, just a fantastically interesting man and politician. He becomes Chancellor in 1949, and he firmly aligns West Germany with the West. During his 14 years as Chancellor of West Germany. West Germany then joins NATO in 1955 and supports European integration, becoming a key member of the European Coal and Steel Community, which would eventually become the EEC after 1957. I believe it comes the EEC. And he prioritized this idea of Westbindung, which means binding with the West, getting closer with the West. And also from 1955, he adopts the Hallstein Doctrine, which we need to know basically is the doctrine maintained by all West German leaders up until really Willy Brandt by the early 1970s, which argues that the FRG, West Germany, would not maintain relations with any country that recognizes the GDR. So it's this almost really firm division of East and West Germany, because it's saying that West Germany won't recognize any nation around the world that recognizes the East. And this helps basically ostracize the East from the international community, and also is important in not recognizing the borders that were, beginning to be established after the World War II. So yeah, again, a kind of another layer or level to the Cold War, these inner German politics that are playing out through the Hallstein Doctrine and Westbindung, which means binding to the West. But crucially, the division is formal, but equally, like, Germany is now directly on the front line of the Cold War. And this is it. Germany is an arena, or Berlin is an arena. It really is the kind of front line of the Cold War. Almost this symbolic and ideological illustration of the Cold War, to be honest with you. And one of the other key consequences is the formation of NATO. So NATO is formed in April 1949, and Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, is hugely instrumental in the creation of NATO here. And really, NATO is so important. Why? Because it is the formal military crystallization of the US's shift from isolationism to globalism. We spoke about it in the last video, traditional US isolationism on foreign policy, but this is showing that the Americans are back on the world stage. They are the world's global policemen, because they signed this treaty that basically in Article 5 argues that an armed attack against one or more members of NATO shall be considered an attack against them all, which therefore dictates that all NATO allies would intervene and would help protect the one that was under attack. Now, the whole point of NATO is that it is a defensive military alliance. NATO does not declare wars on people. NATO is defensive, okay? And it's a defensive military alliance of non-communist states, so basically Western capitalist states. The problem is that Stalin, from an Eastern perspective, from a communist Russian or Soviet perspective, this is seen as capitalist or Western encirclement. Because if you do actually go to a map and you Google NATO countries, you will see that they do encircle that kind of western part of Russia or the USSR, which angers Stalin so significantly. But with our Western hats on, and NATO still to this day is hugely important in our protection and our survival as a nation, and basically hugely important in the fact that there haven't been any major wars in Europe for the last 80 years, outside of course, the war in Ukraine and a few other more minor wars by comparison, relatively, with World War I and World War II. But the Russians are very, very critical of it, or the Soviets are very critical of it. I'm speaking present day and past when I talk about this. The crucial kind of final bit of impact that you need to know is the militarization of the Cold War. This is very much the ossification of two blocks that Mr. Sayer constantly talks about, because we've got the emergence of these two different military blocks firmly in Europe. Not just with NATO, but of course eventually with the formation of the Warsaw Pact. Now, the Warsaw Pact isn't set up straight away. In the short term, the Soviets see NATO as an aggressive organization. We spoke about capitalist encirclement, which was designed to pressurize states into complying with Western capitalist interests. But in the long term, we know the Warsaw Pact is set up in 1955. That's actually after West Germany joins NATO, but the Warsaw Pact is established, and that's the military alliance of Eastern Soviet satellite states, all of which you can see, if I erase this, raise the link on side, that you can see here the different nations that were part of the Warsaw Pact. We made it to the end. Woo! So here's our summary. I'm going to break this unit down just into 4 to 5 bullet points to summarize it. 1. The breakdown of the four-power cooperation in Germany accelerated division after Yalta and Potsdam. 2. Bisonia, the Marshall Plan, and the Deutschmark pushed Germany towards formal partition. The Berlin blockade marked the first major Cold War confrontation and ultimately tested containment. And the creation of East and West Germany formalized the division of Europe into two ideological blocks, coupled with, of course, the creation of NATO in April 1949, which institutionalized military containment and entrenched long-term East-West rivalry, because it led to the militarization of the Cold War when we think about the creation and formal ossification of these two different blocks. There we go. Wow, we've done our first 4 units, and we have done this unit. The final thing that I want to leave you guys with is we begin to see this picture emerging by this point, by 1949, when we consider that China has gone communist. We're beginning to see these two blocks emerge. This early phase of the Cold War has mostly been focused in on Europe, but as we know, from 49 to 55, which is our next unit, it will begin to be globalized when we think about the Pacific and the East as well, and also eventually, obviously, events in Latin and South America. But I want you guys to be thinking, was this division predicted? And of course it was predicted. It was predicted by this man, Eric Arthur Blair, otherwise known as George Orwell, in 1945. But not just that, obviously Churchill in 1946 with his Iron Curtain speech really was prophesizing this division way, way before it happened. And I think that's interesting for us to consider. And I want you guys to consider and look at this timeline here and think, for you, at which point was the Cold War truly on? When can we say that a Cold War had truly begun? And do you agree with Orwell, who really prophesied this in 1945? Or do you think it was later? And that's a nice kind of note to finish on for me. Thank you so much for listening to this video. And yeah, as per, I'm going to leave it on this actually. I'm going to leave it on the summary page. But as usual, happy revising. And thank you for watching.